Hello, everyone. Today we talk about were the Americans just lucky? And for this, we have Justin here.
Hello, everyone.
So recently, I got on my Savo Island video, I got a comment that the Germans and Japanese were basically just lucky with France and with Savo Island and everything. And well, we talked about the Germans already, so we also need to talk about the Americans. And I think Midway is a very good example because some people would probably say, oh, well, at Midway, the Americans were just lucky. So, what is your take on this, Justin?
Yeah, this is probably my favorite go-to example for luck in war. And that's because luck is actually tied very heavily into the traditional mythos or narrative of the Battle of Midway. I mean, it's actually in the titles of two of the most important books on the Battle of Midway. I mean, Walter Lord's incredible victory, and particularly Gordon Prang's miracle at Midway. And then they have lines in there. Walter Lord has a famous line in his book Incredible Victory, quote, "They had no right to win, yet they did, and in doing so they changed the course of the war," end quote. That line is actually etched onto the walls at the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. I went and I read it on the wall. It's also, I think, does a gross disservice to American efforts to win the Battle of Midway. They had every right to win, and that's why they won. And this isn't just me. This is, I think, the general trend of the historiography toward the Battle of Midway is that we've started to move away from it was luck and more toward why things played out the way they did, and that's why we have a far more rounded and I think accurate portrayal of the Battle of Midway now than we did, say, back in the 1960s or even the 1980s when Prang's book Miracle at Midway was published. And he has a lot of the same, similar kind of lines and things. I think I was going, just doing some Kindle searches for words because I have the Kindle edition of Miracle at Midway. Luck is mentioned 54 times in the book. Um, and just reading some of the passages, yeah, a lot of things that now we can kind of more accurately explain. They're just like, oh, it's luck, 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 luck. Um, so I think I come down very hard on no. There was some elements of coincidence, or you could call it luck. For example, decisive attack at 10:25, if I recall correctly, in the morning. It is coincidental or lucky that the Americans accidentally launched an attack that arrived from two different directions at the same time, coordinated with torpedo attack. That was not planned. That was coincidental. However, there were decisions leading up to that created that circumstance. And to backtrack a little bit, the reason why the Battle of Midway occurred at even remotely in the form that it did at all is because of American intelligence efforts, which had nothing to do with luck. Um, that was pure skill and working out, breaking certain Japanese Navy operational codes and piecing together the fragments into a coherent analysis that was then acted on by Nimitz. And then they compiled the resources together there. I don't want to get into extreme detail about any of this just because this isn't a video about Midway, really. It's about luck and war. But none of this is luck. And the American scouting practices that were informed by their pre-battle intelligence, not luck. Various Japanese errors or perceived errors or whatever, that's not luck. That's issues with the Japanese plan or assumptions, or because the Japanese plan assumed surprise, which honestly is not that unreasonable to assume, at least until there are a few little bits and pieces before the battle I'm not going to get into. And just like the Americans play this battle extremely well. They stack their deck, which has nothing to do with luck. I mean, they fill Midway Atoll with as many planes as they can. They strengthen the defenses. They increase their scouting based on the pre-battle intelligence. That would not, by the way, would not have been impossible to do without the pre-battle intelligence they had. They wouldn't have been able to have searches as dense as they did, because you just can't. The carriers were in the position they were because of this pre-battle intelligence. Like, this is huge stuff. And if you fast forward all the way to the decisive attack, yes, okay, so the overall they're attacking from multiple directions. That's coincidental. But McCluskey's decision to follow Arashi back to the fleet, that's you could call it intuition or training, or that was the decision making of the commanding officer. That was not luck. They're like, well, let's follow this back to the fleet. That's a reasonable deduction.
Yeah, you have to be trained to a certain degree or a certain understanding that you make this decision.
Yeah. And then when they get to the fleet, and there is the famous mix-up where McCluskey dives on the wrong carrier. He dives on Kaga. He was supposed to dive on Akagi. And in that moment, Best manages to pull two other SBDs with him to pull out of that dive on Kaga so that they could go hit Akagi. And then that decision by that officer, again, leads to a more decisive outcome at that attack, because if he hadn't made that decision, he would have just dived on Kaga with the rest of them. And as John Partial notes, because he did a talk a few years ago that brushed up against this, is no one would have blamed Dick Best if he had continued his dive on Kaga and everyone had dropped everything on Kaga. It would have been McCluskey that would get all of the hate in post-war histories. He was the guy that lost the Battle of Midway, or didn't, like, missed opportunity. Battle of Midway was far bloodier because McCluskey, he didn't follow doctrine, he screwed up and dove on Kaga. That would be the narrative in a lot of these historical, and Best wouldn't be criticized at all. Yet
Would it even be? I mean, let's assume it turned out a bit different. Midway was called the Miracle. So if it turned out a bit other and only sank, let's say they only sank the Kaga, would have they really criticized him that much? Because I mean, we're talking about a huge victory, and else it would be maybe a draw or a minor victory.
yeah, it gets into counterfactual of, if Akagi survives, that's a significantly stronger Japanese air group that they send out to hit Yorktown. Possibly they sink Yorktown outright, and then they go and find another American carrier and then sink that instead of hitting Yorktown twice. But that's getting into like counterfactual stuff. But I don't think there's any doubt that, like, if that had happened, because McCluskey did break doctrine and he made a mistake and he dove on Kaga,
Ah, okay.
historians very quickly, I think, would have zoomed in on him as the bad guy who screwed this battle up. Like, everything was set up right, and then he couldn't follow doctrine in the heat of the moment, and this is what happened. Whereas, of course, what ends up happening is Best pulls these two other pilots with him. They recover. They go and attack Akagi, bomb it, and that's the fatal hit on Akagi, and the battle progresses as it does. None of this is really luck. That's
I mean, three guys hitting a carrier is also pretty good hit
Yeah,
rate,
I mean,
right?
and Akagi gets a single hit and one near miss, if I remember right, and the hit is Best. But I mean, yeah, that's the main point, is that ultimately all of this stuff leads up to this moment where it comes down to trained air crews need to dive on maneuvering ships that are fighting back and hit them with their bombs, which is kind of, this is not something that's easy to do.
Yeah.
um, there's tons of training. There's a lot of talk of the Japanese, how well trained their pilots were, and it's true. But the American naval aviators as well were also exceptionally well trained. These were not like, spring chickens. Um, they went in, they dove, and they hit their targets, and they end up winning the battle because of their skill. Um, so to chalk it up a lot to luck, or to say they had no right to win, I think does them kind of a disservice. And I know Walter Lord didn't mean it to be a disservice. It's kind of playing into a narrative. Partial kind of alludes to this too, is the Americans like being the scrappy underdogs, and the Battle of Midway's traditional narrative is very much a scrappy underdog story of how we overcame the odds. Um, Whereas it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I mean, the Americans basically set up very methodically for a victory. The Japanese make certain mistakes, and these things combine to a decisive attack that ends, or a decisive series of attacks that ends up destroying four Japanese fleet carriers, and then they bag a cruiser on top of that. Um, and a lot of that is just skill and preparation. It's
Yeah.
less chance, other than it so happened that they managed to coordinate or not coordinate, but they managed to happen upon the Japanese fleet at roughly the same time to throw Japanese fleet defense into chaos. Um, that's one bit of coincidence that I think is worth noting. But when you look at the big picture, a lot of it still chalks up to just skill or preparation.
Yeah, I mean, if you catch an enemy off guard, and if you can't hit like a football field with your dive bomber, good luck hitting a moving carrier that evades with a dive bomber. So
Exactly. I mean, one example you can use is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. I mean, as far as being a like Admiral Ozawa, who's command of the Japanese force, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, he pretty much plays that battle as well as a commander could. Like he does pretty much everything right. In fact, when you read histories of it, Spruance tends to be criticized more than Ozawa, even though Ozawa loses the battle convincingly. And it's because even though Ozawa has done basically everything right, he doesn't have the trained pilots at the tip of the spear to do the damage that they need to do. So it ends up being a convincing Japanese defeat. And it's not because Ozawa was incompetent, it's because they didn't have enough trained aviators to break through and do serious damage to the American fleet, even though Ozawa did as much as he could. So it's the exact opposite example where they set up for some kind of victory and they end up being defeated because of something like pilot training. um, which we don't think about when we think about the Battle of Midway. We just kind of assume, well, they've arrived there, they're going to hit the carriers. Well, as the Battle of Philippine Sea shows, or a lot of these late engagements where the Japanese just throw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of aircraft at the American fleet, that's not exactly something to assume.
yeah, so basically there are two main definitions of luck. The one I pulled from Google is success or failure apparently brought by chance rather than through one's own actions, and the other is, of course, which I'm a huge fan of, and I think that is very applying to military history. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. There's always these aspects coming together. If your men are not trained, if you don't have the right doctrine, you need discipline, you need training, you need equipment, you need maintenance. All that stuff comes there that you actually can use a coincidence, a lucky moment, and exploit it. Else, it just nothing's gonna happen. I made an example in the German video on this, like a situation which turned out in four different ways depending how your troops react or how well trained they are.
Yeah, and I mean, like with the Midway example, there's dozens of little things that if they didn't happen, then there wouldn't have been that coincidence of them showing up at about the same time from two different directions anyway. McCluskey, if he'd been a lesser officer or less attentive, maybe they didn't even notice Arashi going back to the fleet. They just fly on, they miss their target, they return empty handed. Suddenly the Battle of Midway is very different. Or Best, again, doesn't pull out of his dives on Akaga. Akagi survives. The rest of the battle is kind of up in the air, or any other number of little things that were decisions made by people who were trained. And these decisions are what allowed them to exploit this opportunity that was presented to them. So it wasn't just purely luck. I think it's oversimplified,
Yeah.
and it does a disservice to the people who were setting all this stuff up properly. But also it clouds understanding, because if you just say,
Yeah.
oh, it was luck, you don't look deeper at some of these little things that had to happen for this luck to pay off.
Yeah, and it's also important for your personal life, because if you blame everything on luck, yeah. I mean, there was a scientific study done by Weisman, and he wrote a book on it, Luck Factor, and he actually made I really like the book because it trains you to be more lucky and to have more luck in your life. And the other way is, if comes down to luck in your life, you might fall into a victim mentality, and this is not particularly bringing you forward. Okay, I hope you learned something new. Big thank you here, Justin.
Yeah, always nice to be here.
Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.